Can you all see something?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Just setting it up for YouTube and we good to go.
Okay.
Right? We're good.
Okay, so welcome everyone. This will be the open house for the planned action EIS, the draft planned action EIS for the Manufacturing Industrial Center, Cascade Industrial Center, as it's been renamed. This is a process that we need to go through for public notification and comment period. And that being said, this will be turned over to both Radhika Nair and Lisa Gruder from Burt Consulting, and they will lead the presentation tonight and answer questions. So with that, Radhika, you're good to go to your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So in terms of the presentation today, we'll go over the study area, the purpose of the planned action EIS, some of the timeline and milestones, some conceptual alternatives that we've studied in the draft EIS and findings, and then we'll pause for any questions that come up. So I have the study area here on slide 3. And the study area is the Arlington portion of the Cascade Industrial Center. The Cascade Industrial Center itself straddles both Arlington and Marysville. And then
Radhika, I don't
Yeah?
think the slides are advancing for some reason.
Oh,
Are you noticing that as well, Mark?
Yes, it's not advancing. It's still showing the cover.
I'll try again. I think it was the maybe live streaming that's the issue. Okay, can you see it now?
Almost.
There we go.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to try and advance it just in case. Is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So I'll start again. So the study area is the Arlington portion of the Cascade Industrial Center. And as Mark mentioned, the Cascade Industrial Center was formerly known as the Arlington Marysville Manufacturing Industrial Center. And the Manufacturing Industrial Center straddles both Arlington and Marysville, but the draft EIS that we are talking about today is just about the Arlington portion, which includes the Arlington Municipal Airport and is about 2,290 acres. The Cascade Industrial Center draft EIS builds on a lot of the Siberia plan process, including both the vision, the market study that informed the Siberia plan, and the community and stakeholder engagement that happened as part of the Siberia plan. For the adopted Siberia plan, we conducted stakeholder interviews. We had an online community survey where we got about 85 responses. We had a public workshop on just the vision for the area. We had advisory committee meetings. We had a draft plan workshop. And then we also had hearings as part of the legislative process for adoption of the Siberia plan. The draft EIS builds on all of this engagement. And the purpose of the EIS is to be an informational document for decision makers. It identifies environmental implication measures and environmental implications and any mitigation that can actually address these implications. As I mentioned earlier, we also would test some conceptual alternatives to identify these implications, and we'll mix those alternatives together or mix components together to develop a preferred alternative as an iteration of the draft EIS, and that would be a final EIS that will be developed later. The planned action process is something that will actually help us improve the Cascade Industrial Center, because the planned action provides more detailed and comprehensive environmental analysis upfront and looks at it from an area-wide scale, so that it'll help future projects in that it won't require individual SEPA determinations, and this can both simplify and speed up the planned action process. And so the planned action is in many ways an economic development tool, because it will help us improve and attract development to the center. In terms of the timeline for the process, we started out in spring 2020. We had a scoping period, a 21-day scoping period where we got a few comments, and I'll reference that in the next slide. We are now in the draft EIS phase. We are in the comment period. We have 30 days for you to provide us with any comments on the draft. And once we receive those comments by the end of the year, we'll respond to comments, we'll evaluate the conceptual alternatives and develop a final preferred alternative. We expect that council will take action on a preferred alternative sometime in early next year or by the end of the year. I want to talk a bit about the scoping period and some of the comments that we got. We got 3 comments primarily. We got comments from the Department of Ecology that reference state regulations that apply to dangerous waste. We got comments from community transit where we were asked to address transit demand from the conceptual alternatives. We also got detailed comments from WSDOT on the scope of the transportation analysis. While we didn't get a formal scoping comment, the city has been in communication with the tribes and made sure to accommodate any concerns or questions that they might have had with the scoping of the area and any of the alternatives that we might look at. And before I talk about the conceptual alternatives that we tested in the EIS, I wanted to talk a bit about the Siberia plan's vision for the CIC. And given that the CIC is a manufacturing industrial center, which is intended to be a concentrated area of industrial and manufacturing activity, the Siberia plan's vision for the CIC is to serve as this industrial and manufacturing center for Snohomish County, and to include a diverse range of job-rich industrial activity. And given that the interest is in job-rich sectors, the Siberia plan also identified a few desired sectors like aerospace, advanced manufacturing, give me 1 second. Aerospace, advanced manufacturing, food processing, maritime, wood products, and mass timber manufacturing are some of these job-rich sectors that would be a good fit for the area given community interest, city interest, as well as the long history in Snohomish County with these sectors. 3 scenarios were evaluated in the EIS, and these include 1, which is a no action alternative, which is basically existing conditions, assuming that the current comprehensive plan and zoning would continue. And then another one, because the EIS tests these bookends, we tend to think about alternatives that can show some differences. And alternative 1 is one that we constructed based on the vision of the Siberia plan. So it has the geographical vision in terms of where the jobs would go and the economic vision in terms of the sectors of the Siberia plan. And I'll talk about these alternatives and their differences in more detail in subsequent slides. The alternative 2 is one we call the high growth alternative, which essentially assumes that existing patterns would continue, but then there would be really high growth and the growth would extend in existing ways. And once we go through the draft EIS process and get comments on these conceptual alternatives, we'll develop a preferred alternative, and we can mix and match, we can combine them all together or combine specific components together, or just assume that one of these alternatives would be the preferred alternative. So the first one in terms of the alternative that I wanted to talk about is the no action alternative. The no action alternative would continue the current comprehensive plan designation and zoning for the area. So this would assume that there would be manufacturing and industrial jobs, and they would continue existing patterns. There would be a diverse range. There currently are a lot of aerospace manufacturing jobs. There are several warehousing and transportation jobs. And so all of that would continue. And the no action alternative would allow growth rounded about 4,824 jobs. And one of the things that's important to note about the no action alternative is that it assumes no change to housing within the center. There is a small amount of housing currently, and that would continue. And no uses such as workforce development or educational or other uses are anticipated as part of the no action alternative. For alternative 1, which is the Cascade Center Vision sectors, which is essentially the sub-area plan alternative, it would have the job growth and the geographical distribution. If you look at the map on the right, it shows where the areas of job density would be. And these darker areas correspond to areas that in the sub-area plan we identified as priority or shovel-ready sites or opportunity sites. So there would be more jobs on those parcels. It's envisioned that instead of following current patterns, the sectors that would be attracted to the CIC would be the ones that I earlier referenced, the desired sectors like aerospace, advanced manufacturing, food processing, and others. And employment would take advantage of the area's natural features, and we envision that Edgecombe Creek would be relocated. And in addition to high density manufacturing and industrial employment, this alternative also assumes that there would be workforce development and entrepreneurial support facilities that would happen on priority sites, and that there would also be a small amount of residential development that would be suitable for industrial jobs like live work or other units that would be included in this alternative. I'll talk a bit about the number of jobs and housing differences in a subsequent slide, but this alternative is the medium growth alternative in terms of jobs and does assume an addition of about 6,000 net jobs. Alternative 2 is the high growth alternative. It assumes current existing patterns of sectors, and it just distributes jobs in all across parcels where there is capacity. And this would also include a relocated Edgecombe Creek, but the sectoral patterns would remain the same. There would be no housing, there would be no workforce training or incubators or anything like that. And this is expected because without any of those investments, it's assumed that the same sectoral pattern will continue. This slide has a comparison of some of the population housing units and jobs associated with each of the alternatives. So as I mentioned earlier, the no action alternative is the one that has the fewest jobs. It assumes that there are about 5,000 jobs in the CIC right now, 4,969 jobs. So the no action alternative assumes a total of about 9,793, so adding about 4,800 jobs. Alternative 1 assumes that there will be about 11,594 jobs, so adding about 6,000, a little more than 6,500 jobs. Alternative 2 is the high growth alternative, which would have a total of 13,000 jobs, so adding almost double the number of jobs there right now at 8,800, in somewhere in that. In terms of housing units, as I mentioned earlier, the no action alternative and the high growth alternative would add no new housing, while action alternative 1, which is the sub-area plan vision alternative, would add about 500 units of housing. Following and reflecting the population of housing units added, the population would remain the same. The resident population would remain the same under the existing and the no action alternative, while it would increase slightly under alternative 1 by about 1,300 people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to just talk through the EIS contents and some key findings. Lisa, is the PowerPoint working okay? Should I zoom in or out?
I think if you go to that little page just to the left of the icon that you're on, it will size it.
Yeah, at the bottom right corner by the percentages.
So right now you're on like a continuous flow. If you go one to the left,
So facing, oh no, not facing.
left.
Single page?
Yeah,
Yep.
there you go.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thanks, Radhika. So the EIS is structured so that Chapter 1 is the summary, and that will give you an overview of all the environmental topics in the document, and you can use that to decide how much to dive into any other particular topics. Chapter 2 covers the alternatives that Radhika just described. Chapter 3 goes over the environmental impacts and mitigation measures for each of the topics we covered. Then we have references and a distribution and appendices as well. The findings for the natural environment were pretty similar across all alternatives. The area is already highly altered, and the city critical area regulations will protect those features. So there will be limited critical area impacts. But with the advent of development comes the opportunity to implement green infrastructure through development, stormwater features, as well as streets are improved to city standards. There's opportunities to add low impact development design. For cultural resources, because development could occur anywhere on the sites that may have the potential for cultural resources, there's no substantial difference among the alternatives. The firm CRC did do some site surveys, reconnaissance level for areas of potential effect. And they found no previously unrecorded archaeological sites or historic properties. So no new sites were identified. They do recommend that the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation be consulted to determine the need for cultural resource surveys. And we'll talk about that a little more in the planned action. We'll dive into transportation in a little bit more detail. For land use and aesthetics, new development will need to be consistent with, or will be consistent with, state and regional growth policies that focus growth in centers, and this manufacturing industrial center is a regional growth center. There are some policy implications for the location of jobs. All of the alternatives, though, provide sufficient capacity for the anticipated growth. And the heights are generally similar among the alternatives, and there would need to be application of design guidelines to ensure proper transitions among the uses. For utilities and public services, most infrastructure is in place. There are some undeveloped portions that would need the extension of infrastructure. There would be no significant impacts on police, schools, or parks, which are driven more, at least for schools and parks, by population, and there would be limited population. The city has some system plans that guide the extension of infrastructure. So if you want to go to the next slide, Radhika, we can cover transportation. These maps identify existing facilities. So existing non-motorized facilities on the far left, transit routes in the center, and freight corridors that extend throughout the industrial center. For transportation, the action alternatives with additional growth would add trips and impact the system beyond what would occur for the no action alternative. As Radhika mentioned, the alternatives are sort of a bookend, low, medium, and high. There are several intersections that operate at LOS F, level of service F, during the weekday PM peak hour that would happen with or without the action alternatives. There are 3 intersections that would have worse operations under both the action and no action alternatives. And those that wouldn't improve, regardless of the alternative selected, would be considered significant unavoidable impacts. There could be some secondary impacts related to widening SR 531 as part of the proposed mitigation for the action alternatives. With those corridor improvements, there could be shifts to traffic volumes and delays could increase. However, the EIS does address some measures to reduce reliance on auto travel to help reduce these secondary impacts. That would be encouraging transit use with major large employers. Transit ridership and travel times and demands for all modes would increase. There are non-motorized facilities, as we showed on an earlier map, and as development occurs, there would need to be additional linkages. The no action and action alternatives that show impact, 6 of the 12 would operate at LOSF, and under the action alternatives, there's additional locations in other directions. There are improvements planned in the city's Transportation Improvement Program and the state's Transportation Improvement Program. Those intersections that have been identified for poor operations would be proposed for improvement, and we'll get into in the planned action that they would be, there would be a cost share for development to help pay for the cost of those improvements. So that brings us to the planned action ordinance, which is meant to take the findings of the EIS and implement them and be conditions on top of the code, but it provides more certainty for both property owners and business owners and developers. So the ordinance is set up in a typical fashion with recitals, purpose, and findings. Then there's some procedures that each planned action would go through to be determined a planned action. There's a provision for monitoring every so many years. Then there are some exhibits that show that in order to be a planned action, you have to be within the boundary we studied. And then there's a modified checklist that builds off the EIS that each planned action would submit when they come in for their permit approvals. And then there's a series of mitigation measures and standards and a reminder to applicants about applicable regulations. So some of the criteria to be considered a planned action would be that you fit within the land use type and growth levels. So when the city picks a preferred alternative, there'll be one set of numbers that the ordinance will build off of. There will also be a criteria to be within the bank of traffic trips that were evaluated. And when the preferred alternative is selected, that'll be filled in and we'll have one set of traffic numbers. So the mitigation measures in the planned action ordinance, they're identified in the appendix to the EIS. If you compare what's in the body of the EIS to that draft ordinance, some of the shoulds become shalls, and all the topics are covered from the EIS. For transportation, as I mentioned earlier, there would be a SEPA mitigation fee based on the demand for new improvements. There are cost estimates for those improvements, and the cost estimates would be divided by the proportional share of trips. So this document was posted on October 1st, and the city's taking comments through October 30th by 5 p.m. You can go to the city's website, the link there, where there's public notices, and you'll see the document and the notice of availability, and you can send comments to Mark Hayes at Community and Economic Development.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. Radhika. I don't know that we have any.
We do have one citizen in the group named Scott. Scott, would you like to provide any comments? I have asked him to mute, appears to unmute, so I would assume he does not have a comment.
Okay.
And we do not have any comments on our YouTube as well.
Quiet audience.
Yes.
Radhika, one thing I noticed on the slides is that when you were showing what type of job clusters there were, that the robotics was not included in that.
Sorry, I'll add that. I always assume it as a subset of advanced manufacturing, but I know in the DEIS we called out robotics. So
Right. Yeah. Well done. I don't know that we're going to get much response here, at least not tonight, but we'll wait and see how the comment period progresses here.
Yes, this is the introduction.
Right. Well, that went pretty quickly. So the Planning Commission presentation should be close to that. What were we about 25 minutes, more or less?
Yeah.
Yeah. That'll work out perfect.
Do you want me to go ahead and end it on YouTube?
Yeah, I mean, if we don't have any more comments in this, then the presentation's over. I think we should just go ahead and close out. So we're just going to go ahead and close out since there's no comments. Nobody's shown any intent to provide comments here tonight. So we'll give you a little reprieve until 7 o'clock.
okay, sounds good.
It's a good test run, though. Appreciate it.
Yeah,